late 1867, in Japan, people began reporting something strange. Small paper charms, religious talismans, were appearing in towns, on rooftops, in the streets. Some claimed they had fallen from the sky. And then something even stranger happened. Entire communities began to dance. Not during a festival, not following any official order, but spontaneously. Villages, neighborhoods, groups of strangers, moving through the streets as if they were responding to something unseen. This event would later be called Eja, and it really happened. But even today, historians still ask, why did thousands of people react to something so ordinary, as if it carried a message? And more importantly, why was Japan not the only place where ordinary things suddenly began to feel like signs? To understand why something like Eja could happen, we need to step back and look at Japan in the mid-19th century, because this was not a normal time. For more than 200 years, Japan had lived under a system known as the Tokugawa shogunate, a rigid, highly controlled society where foreign contact was limited, movement was regulated, and social classes were fixed. For generations, this system had created stability, but by the 1850s, that stability was beginning to crack. In 1853, American warships led by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived off the coast of Japan. They were unlike anything most people in Japan had ever seen. Black ships, steam-powered, impossible to ignore. They carried a simple message: Japan could no longer remain isolated. Within a few years, the country was forced to open its ports to foreign trade, and with that, everything began to change. Japan was suddenly exposed to a world it had spent centuries avoiding: foreign goods, foreign ideas, and foreign power. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the growing sense that the old order might not survive. Inside the country, tension was rising. Samurai questioned their role. Merchants gained influence. Peasants faced economic strain. The authority of the shogunate, once unquestioned, began to weaken. Political factions formed. Some demanded reform. Others demanded a return to tradition. Some called for the restoration of imperial rule. By the 1860s, Japan was no longer stable. It was uncertain. And uncertainty has a very specific effect on societies. It changes how people interpret the world around them. When systems feel reliable, events are seen as ordinary. But when systems begin to break down, the same events can start to feel like signs. A bad harvest is no longer just a bad harvest. A disease is no longer just a disease. And sometimes, something as simple as a piece of paper can begin to feel like a message. By 1867, the Tokugawa shogunate was approaching its end. Power was shifting rapidly, and rumors were spreading faster than facts. Information was uneven, fragmented, and often contradictory. Across the country, people were trying to make sense of what was happening, not through official explanations, but through interpretation, through stories, and through shared reactions. So when small paper talismans began appearing in towns, they did not enter a calm society. They entered a society already on edge, already searching, already asking, what is happening to our world? And more importantly, what does it mean? Because in moments like this, people don't just see events, they try to read them. And once that process begins, once ordinary things start to feel meaningful, it can spread, quietly, quickly, and sometimes uncontrollably. So how exactly did these talismans appear? Who was behind them? And why did they trigger something so much larger than anyone could have expected? That is where the story really begins. When the talismans first appeared, they did not arrive with explanation. No official announcement, no clear origin, no single person claiming responsibility. They simply appeared. In towns across Western Japan, Kyoto, Osaka, and the surrounding regions, people began reporting the same thing. Small paper amulets, often associated with the Ise Grand Shrine, showing up in unexpected places. On rooftops, in private homes, in courtyards, sometimes discovered in the morning, as if they had arrived overnight. Some said they had fallen from the sky. Others believed they had been scattered by unseen hands. A few suspected pranksters. But no explanation fully accounted for the scale or the speed of the reports. And at first these were just rumors, stories passed from one town to another. But then, something changed. The people began to react, not with fear, but with celebration. Groups gathered in the streets, clapping, chanting, dancing. These were not organized festivals in the traditional sense. There were no formal invitations, no official rituals, no clear structure. And yet they spread. Entire neighborhoods would suddenly erupt into movement. Men, women, and children joining in, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. They called it Ejanaika. Roughly translated, it means, "Isn't it fine?" Why not? It's okay, isn't it? A phrase that feels casual, almost indifferent. But in this context, it carried something else. A release, a permission. As if people were collectively deciding, at the same time, that the normal rules no longer applied. Observers at the time described scenes that were both festive and unsettling. People wearing unusual costumes, dancing through the streets in loose formations, chanting repetitive phrases, moving from one place to another as if following an invisible current. In some cases, people entered private homes without invitation, joining dances already in progress, then leaving just as suddenly. In others, participants seemed to act with a kind of temporary detachment, as if they were no longer bound by everyday social expectations. And then, just as suddenly as it began in one place, it would stop, only to appear somewhere else. This was not a single event. It was a wave, spreading across regions, moving unpredictably, appearing and disappearing without clear direction. So what exactly triggered it? Was it the talismans, or was something already building beneath the surface? Some accounts suggest that the talismans themselves became a kind of catalyst, because they were associated with Ise, one of the most sacred Shinto sites in Japan. They carried religious significance. To find one in your home could be interpreted as a blessing or a sign. And once that interpretation took hold, the meaning of the event changed. It was no longer just an object. It was a message. But not everyone agreed. Some contemporary reports, especially from local officials, suggested that the talismans may have been deliberately distributed, possibly by groups seeking to create excitement or even to encourage pilgrimage to Ise. Others believed the phenomenon was driven less by the objects themselves, and more by the social atmosphere of the time. A society under pressure, a population surrounded by uncertainty, looking for release, looking for meaning, and finding both in a shared, spontaneous act. There were also more critical interpretations. Some elites saw Ejanaika as disorder, as a breakdown of social norms, as evidence that the population was becoming unpredictable, even uncontrollable. In a system already under strain, this was not a comforting sign, because what made the phenomenon truly unusual was not just the dancing, it was how quickly it spread. Without modern communication, without centralized organization, without a clear leader, and yet, somehow, the same behavior appeared in multiple places, within a relatively short period of time. How? How does a reaction like that move through a society? How do thousands of people, separated by distance and circumstance, begin responding in similar ways to something so ambiguous? Was it imitation? Was it rumor? Was it something more subtle? Something that doesn't leave clear records? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, were people reacting to the talismans themselves, or to what those talismans represented? Because by the late 1860s, Japan was already filled with signals, political signals, economic signals, cultural signals. The old world was weakening, the new world was unclear, and in that kind of environment, meaning becomes unstable. Objects take on new significance, events feel amplified, and actions, once unthinkable, become possible. So Janaka may not have been caused by the talismans alone. It may have been something larger. A moment when a society, under pressure, briefly stepped outside its own rules. Not through rebellion in the traditional sense, not through organized protest, but through something harder to define. A shared reaction, a collective shift, one that left behind no clear leader, no unified explanation, and no single narrative that fully explains what happened. But here is where the story becomes even more unsettling. Because Japan was not the only place where ordinary things began to feel like signs. Around the same time, in another part of the world, something just as simple and just as mysterious was beginning to move from village to village. Not paper, but bread. In early 1857, in northern India, something began to move quietly through the countryside. It was not an army, not a message written on paper, not an official decree. It was bread. Simple, round flatbreads, chapatis, began appearing in villages, passed from one person to another, carried across long distances with no clear explanation. A villager would receive a chapati from a traveler or a local messenger. They would be told to make several more, and then pass them on, to the next village and the next. No written instructions, no clear origin, no explanation of purpose, just the act of passing. And it spread, across regions, across communities, across hundreds of miles. British colonial officials began noticing the pattern. Reports started appearing in administrative records. Officers described chapatis being distributed in the dead of night, carried by runners who moved quickly and quietly between settlements. Each village seemed to understand what to do, but no one could clearly explain why. Some villagers said it was a warning, others believed it was a ritual. Some treated it as an obligation, something to be done without question. And for the British authorities, this was deeply unsettling, because it looked like communication. But it was not a form they could read. There were no documents to intercept, no messages to decode, no leaders to arrest, only movement and repetition. So they began to ask the same question that historians still ask today. What were the chapatis for? One theory suggested that the distribution was connected to an impending crisis. A signal, a way of preparing communities for something that had not yet happened. Another interpretation saw it as a form of social contagion, a behavior that spread simply because people saw others doing it. A chain reaction without a central cause. But the timing made it difficult to ignore, because only months later, in May 1857, a massive uprising would break out against British rule. The event would later be called the Indian Rebellion of 1857, or by some the First War of Independence. And in hindsight, the chapati movement began to look different. What had seemed like a strange, meaningless activity now appeared to some observers as a prelude, a warning, or even a form of preparation. But there is a problem with that interpretation. There is no clear evidence that the chapati distribution was directly coordinated with the rebellion. No confirmed link, no documented chain of command, no explicit instructions connecting the two. Some historians argue that the connection is exaggerated, that colonial officials, already anxious about unrest, projected meaning onto something they did not understand. Others suggest that even if the chapatis were not part of a coordinated plan, they may still reflect something real, a shared atmosphere, a sense that something was coming. And that sense, even without clear communication, could spread. Much like Eijanai Ka in Japan, the chapati movement did not rely on formal structures. There was no central authority, no official network. And yet, it moved. From person to person, from village to village, carried not by orders but by participation. And once again, something ordinary had become something else. A piece of bread turned into a signal. Not because of what it was, but because of what people believed it might mean. And that is where the pattern begins to emerge. In Japan, it was paper. In India, it was bread. Different cultures, different contexts, different belief systems, and yet the same transformation. Ordinary objects becoming carriers of meaning. Ambiguous actions becoming shared responses. And perhaps most importantly, people reacting not to certainty, but to possibility, because neither the talismans nor the chapatis came with clear explanations. They were open to interpretation, and in times of uncertainty, interpretation becomes powerful. It fills the gaps left by incomplete information. It connects events that may not actually be connected, and it creates a sense of coherence in a world that no longer feels stable. But this pattern does not stop with symbolic objects, because in other parts of the world, around the same period, the same shift in perception began to take on a darker form. Not celebration, not ritual, but fear. Fear of contamination. Fear of hidden intent. Fear that something unseen was actively causing harm. And when that happens, the consequences are very different. By the mid-19th century, another kind of movement was spreading across Europe and parts of the Russian Empire. But this time, it did not look like celebration. It did not feel like ritual. It felt like fear. Cholera, an infectious disease that could kill within hours, had begun to move through cities and towns with terrifying speed. Entire neighborhoods could fall sick almost overnight. Families would wake up healthy, and by the end of the day, someone would be gone. At the time, no one fully understood how the disease worked. The germ theory of disease had not yet been widely accepted. Many still believed illness spread through bad air or miasma. Others suspected contaminated water, but there was no clear consensus. And in that uncertainty, something familiar began to happen. People started looking for explanations, not just medical explanations, but meaningful ones. In several cities across Russia, Eastern Europe, and even parts of Western Europe, rumors began to circulate. Doctors were poisoning patients. Officials were deliberately spreading disease. Hospitals were places where people went to die, not to be cured. These ideas did not come from official sources. They emerged from conversations, from fear, from observation filtered through uncertainty. And once again, ordinary elements of daily life began to shift in meaning. Medical tools no longer looked like instruments of healing. They looked suspicious. Hospitals no longer felt safe. They felt dangerous, and people began to act on those interpretations. In 1831, during one of the earliest cholera outbreaks in the Russian Empire, riots broke out in several cities. Crowds gathered outside hospitals, accusing doctors of killing patients. In some cases, medical staff were attacked, buildings were damaged, authorities struggled to restore order. This was not an isolated incident. Similar reactions appeared in other regions during later outbreaks. The pattern repeated. A disease spreads. Understanding is limited. Rumors emerge. Trust breaks down. And fear turns into action. To modern observers, these reactions may seem irrational, but in context, they follow a certain logic. People were witnessing death on a scale they could not explain. They saw individuals enter hospitals and not return. They observed treatments that did not seem to work, and without a clear framework to understand what was happening, they turned to interpretation. Much like the talismans in Japan. Much like the chapatis in India. But now, the emotional tone had changed. What had once been celebration, or quiet transmission, had become suspicion. And suspicion can spread faster than any disease, because it does not require evidence. It only requires uncertainty. And once enough people begin to interpret events in the same way, that interpretation becomes reality, at least in its consequences. Crowds gather, accusations spread, violence becomes possible. So once again, the question appears, were these reactions based on actual evidence, or were they the result of a deeper shift in how people were perceiving the world? Because the disease itself was real. The deaths were real. But the interpretation that doctors were intentionally causing harm remains controversial. Most historians today view these accusations as a product of fear and misunderstanding, a tragic response to a crisis without clear answers. But even if the explanation is fear, that does not make the pattern less important. In fact, it makes it more revealing, because now we see the same underlying mechanism in a different form. In Japan, uncertainty led to celebration. In India, it led to silent coordination. In Europe, it led to suspicion and violence. Different outcomes, same structure. Ordinary things, paper, bread, medicine, no longer interpreted as what they are, but as something else, something hidden, something meaningful, something potentially dangerous. And at this point, the pattern is no longer subtle. It is visible across regions, across cultures, across different types of events. But there is still one more layer to this story, because in some places, this shift did not stop at objects or institutions. It went further, into the human body itself, where death was no longer seen as an end, but as a sign that something might still be happening, something unfinished, something unnatural. And when that idea takes hold, the consequences become even more personal. By the late 19th century, the pattern had moved even closer, closer than cities, closer than institutions, closer than crowds. It had entered the family. In 1892, in the small rural town of Exeter, Rhode Island, a young woman named Mercy Brown died of tuberculosis. At the time, the disease was often called consumption. It was slow, relentless, and deeply feared. Victims would grow pale and thin. They would cough, weaken, and gradually fade over weeks or months. In many families, more than one person would fall ill in succession. And in the Brown family, that is exactly what happened. Mercy's mother had already died of the disease. Her sister followed. And when Mercy herself became sick, her brother Edwin also began to show symptoms. From the perspective of modern medicine, this pattern is tragically familiar. Tuberculosis spreads through close contact. Families living together were especially vulnerable. But in 1892, that explanation was not widely understood. And once again, uncertainty opened the door to interpretation. As Edwin's condition worsened, members of the community began to consider a different possibility. What if one of the dead was not truly gone? What if something from the grave was still affecting the living? This belief was not unique to Rhode Island. Variations of it had existed in European folklore for centuries. But what makes this case unusual is not the belief itself. It is the timing. This was not the medieval period. This was the late 19th century. A time when railroads, telegraphs, and modern institutions already existed. And yet, in this moment, the explanation that gained traction was not medical. It was supernatural. Local accounts describe growing concern within the community. The idea spread that one of the deceased family members might be returning, drawing life from the living. A vampire. Not in the modern, fictional sense, but in a more ambiguous, localized form. Something not fully dead, but not fully gone. Eventually, the decision was made. The bodies would be exhumed. In March of 1892, several members of the Brown family were dug up and examined. What they found was interpreted as evidence. Mercy's body, unlike the others, showed relatively little decomposition. There was still blood in her heart. To modern science, this can be explained. The ground had been cold. Her body had been preserved. But to those present, it meant something else. It suggested activity, presence, life, where there should have been none. And so, they acted. Mercy's heart was removed and burned. The ashes were mixed into a tonic and given to her brother Edwin to drink, an attempt to stop the illness. It did not work. Edwin died 2 months later. From a modern perspective, this is a tragic story shaped by misunderstanding, but within its historical context, it follows the same pattern we have already seen. A disease spreads. Understanding is limited. People search for meaning, and that meaning begins to take form. Not in institutions, not in objects, but in the body itself. The human body becomes evidence, a sign, something to be interpreted. And once again, ordinary processes, death, decomposition, are no longer seen as natural. They are seen as something else, something intentional, something active, something that requires a response. What makes the Mercy Brown case especially striking is how personal it is. This is not a crowd reacting in the streets. This is a family, a community, facing loss, trying to understand what is happening, trying to regain control in a situation where control feels impossible. And in that attempt, they turn to a framework that offers explanation, even if that explanation leads them further away from what we would now consider reality. But the question remains, was this simply ignorance, or was it something more complex? Because by this point, we have seen the same underlying process in very different forms. In Japan, people danced. In India, they passed bread. In Europe, they rioted. And in Rhode Island, they opened graves. Different actions, different beliefs, different consequences. But each one begins the same way, with something ordinary, becoming something else. And at this point, it becomes difficult to dismiss these events as isolated, because they are not. They are connected, not by direct communication, not by shared culture, but by a pattern that raises a deeper question. What changes in a society when people stop trusting what they see? By this point in the story, the events begin to overlap, not in time, not in place, but in structure. Japan, India, Europe, the United States, different societies, different belief systems, different pressures. And yet, something about these events feels familiar. In each case, something ordinary appears. A piece of paper, a piece of bread, a medical treatment, a human body. On their own, these things are not unusual. They are part of everyday life. But in each case, they stop being ordinary. They become something else, something charged with meaning. In Japan, paper talismans were not just objects. They became signs, possible messages from a sacred source. People did not simply observe them. They reacted. In India, chapatis were not just food. They became carriers of something undefined. But people passed them on, not because they understood them, but because they felt compelled to participate. In Europe, medicine was no longer just treatment. It became suspicious, a possible tool of harm. People did not just fear disease. They began to fear those trying to cure it. And in Rhode Island, the human body itself was no longer just a body. It became evidence, interpreted as proof that something unseen was still active. So what connects these events? At first, the answer seems simple: uncertainty. Each of these societies was experiencing disruption: political instability in Japan, colonial tension in India, public health crisis in Europe, medical uncertainty in the United States. But uncertainty alone is not enough to explain what happened, because uncertainty does not always produce the same response. Sometimes it leads to reform, sometimes to conflict, sometimes to adaptation. But here, it leads to something more specific, a shift in interpretation. In each case, people are not just reacting to events, they are trying to read them, trying to extract meaning from incomplete information, trying to understand what is happening when the usual explanations no longer feel sufficient. And once that process begins, a pattern emerges. It follows a sequence. Something ambiguous appears. People begin to interpret it. That interpretation spreads, and eventually it produces action. Not always organized, not always rational, but consistent, and importantly, shared. This is what makes these events different from isolated superstition. They are collective. They involve large numbers of people. They're often acting in similar ways without direct coordination. Which raises a more difficult question. How does interpretation spread? How do people, separated by distance and context, begin to see the same thing in similar ways? There are several possibilities. One is imitation. People hear about an event and they reproduce the behavior. Another is rumor. Information moves through informal networks, stories, conversations, local reports. But there may be something deeper. A shared psychological response to instability. When the world becomes unpredictable, people look for patterns. They search for signals. They become more sensitive to anomalies. And in that state, the boundary between observation and interpretation begins to blur. A coincidence starts to feel intentional, but an object starts to feel symbolic. An event starts to feel like a message, not because it is, but because it fits the need for explanation. And once enough people begin to interpret events in that way, the interpretation becomes self-reinforcing. It spreads, it stabilizes, it becomes, temporarily, a shared reality. This is the moment when a society begins to behave differently, not because the world itself has changed dramatically, but because the way the world is being read has changed. And that may be the most important anomaly of all. Not the talismans, not the chapatis, not the riots or the exhumations, but the shift in perception that connects them. A moment when ordinary things no longer feel ordinary, when meaning becomes unstable, and when people begin to act, not on what they know, but on what they think something might mean. So by the end of the 19th century, we are no longer looking at a series of strange events. We are looking at a pattern, a recurring way of responding to uncertainty, one that appears in different forms, across different societies, under different pressures, but always with the same underlying structure: ambiguity, interpretation, spread, action. And once we see that pattern, another question begins to emerge. Not just about the past, but about the nature of history itself. Are these events truly unusual? Or are they revealing something more constant? Something that appears whenever systems begin to break down? Once we begin to see a pattern, the next question becomes unavoidable. How do we explain it? Why would different societies, under different conditions, begin to interpret ordinary things as if they carried hidden meaning? Historians have approached this question from several directions. None of them fully explains every case, but each offers part of the picture. 1. Social crisis and uncertainty. The most widely accepted explanation begins with instability. In every case we have seen, the events occur during periods of disruption. Japan in the 1860s, political collapse and the end of a centuries-old system. India in 1857, colonial tension and the build-up to rebellion. Europe during cholera outbreaks, public health crises without clear explanation. Rural America, families facing a disease they could not understand. In these conditions, people are forced to navigate uncertainty, and when existing systems, political, medical, or social, fail to provide clear answers, interpretation fills the gap. This explanation is grounded in historical evidence. We know that uncertainty increases rumor. We know that crisis reduces trust. We know that fear amplifies perception. But this still leaves a question. Why does uncertainty sometimes produce very specific kinds of behavior? Why talismans, and not something else? Why chapatis, and not another object? Why accusations of poisoning instead of other explanations? Crisis explains why people are searching, but it does not fully explain what they find. 2. Information, gaps and rumor networks. A second explanation focuses on communication. In the 19th century, information systems were expanding, but still incomplete. Newspapers existed, but were not universally trusted. Telegraphs connected cities, but not rural areas. Literacy rates varied widely. As a result, much information still moved through informal channels. Stories, word of mouth, local interpretation. In that environment, rumors could spread quickly and change as they moved. A single event could be retold in multiple ways, each version slightly different, each version shaped by local fears and expectations. The chapati movement is often explained this way, not as a coordinated signal, but as a chain of actions sustained by imitation and rumor. The same may be true of eerie, local events, repeated and amplified until they appear widespread and unified. This explanation is persuasive. But again, it is incomplete because rumor alone does not explain why people act. It explains how ideas spread, but not why those ideas become compelling enough to drive behavior, sometimes extreme behavior. 3. Psychological pattern seeking. A third explanation looks inward, at the human mind itself. Humans are pattern-seeking by nature. We look for connections. We search for meaning. We try to impose order on uncertainty. This is not a flaw. It is a survival mechanism. But under certain conditions, especially stress and instability, It can become amplified. People begin to see patterns where none exist. They connect unrelated events. They interpret coincidence as intention. In modern psychology, this is sometimes described as apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections in random or ambiguous data. From this perspective, the talismans, the chapatis, the medical rumors, and the vampire fears are not fundamentally different phenomena. They are different expressions of the same cognitive process. Faced with uncertainty, people construct meaning. And once constructed, that meaning feels real. But even this explanation has limits, because it treats these events as individual psychological responses. And yet, what we see in history is collective. Large groups of people, sometimes entire communities, arriving at similar interpretations, at similar times, without direct coordination. So the question becomes, how do individual perceptions become shared realities? 4. Collective behavior and social contagion. A fourth explanation focuses on groups, not individuals. Historians and sociologists sometimes describe these events as forms of collective behavior, situations where people act together outside established norms, often in response to unclear or changing conditions. In these moments, behavior can spread, not through formal instruction, but through observation and participation. One person acts, others follow. The behavior gains momentum. This is sometimes called social contagion. Not in the medical sense, but in the behavioral sense. Ideas, emotions, and actions spreading through a population. From this perspective, Ka becomes a wave of collective expression. The chapati movement becomes a chain reaction of participation. Cholera riots become shared fear turning into action. The Mercy Brown case becomes a localized expression of a broader belief system. This explanation helps connect individual psychology with group behavior. It shows how interpretation can scale, but it still leaves something unresolved, because not all societies, under stress, produce the same forms of collective behavior. So why these forms? Why these specific manifestations? 5. Cultural frameworks and available beliefs. The final explanation looks at culture, at the systems of belief already present in a society. In Japan, the talismans were linked to Shinto traditions and the Ise shrine. In India, the chapati movement emerged within a context of local networks, ritual practices, and colonial tension. In Europe, fear of poisoning drew on distrust of authority and limited medical understanding. In New England, the Mercy Brown case reflected lingering folk beliefs about death and the body. In each case, people didn't invent meaning from nothing. They drew from what was already available, from existing symbols, existing fears, existing narratives. Culture provides the language of interpretation. It shapes what people are able to see when they try to make sense of the unknown. And this may be the most comprehensive explanation so far. Crisis creates uncertainty. Information gaps allow rumors to spread. The mind searches for patterns. Groups reinforce behavior, and culture shapes the form that behavior takes. Together, these factors create the conditions for the pattern we have observed. But even when combined, they do not fully resolve the mystery, because they explain the process, but not the feeling. They describe how these events happen, but not why, in the moment, they feel so convincing to those experiencing them. Why a piece of paper feels like a message. Why bread feels like a signal. Why a body feels like evidence of something beyond death. And perhaps that is the limit of explanation, because at some point, history moves from analysis into experience, and experience does not always translate cleanly into theory. So we are left with multiple explanations, each one useful, each one incomplete, and together they bring us closer to understanding the pattern, but not to fully resolving it, because the pattern itself raises a deeper question, not just about these events, but about how societies respond to uncertainty, and whether this is something unique to the 19th century, or something more universal. To move beyond interpretation, we need to look at what the historical record actually shows, because these events were not imagined, they were documented, but the way they were documented is part of the mystery. 1. Newspapers and contemporary reports. In Japan, accounts of Eija Naika appear in local records, official reports, and later historical reconstructions. Descriptions vary, but many agree on the core elements: sudden appearances of talismans, spontaneous dancing, and rapid spread across regions. However, the tone of these reports is inconsistent. Some describe the events as festive, others as disorderly. Some emphasize religious meaning, others focus on social disruption. This variation suggests that even at the time, people were not seeing the same event in the same way. They were interpreting it. In India, British colonial archives provide some of the clearest documentation of the chapati movement. District officers wrote reports noting the movement of chapatis from village to village. They recorded confusion among local populations and concern among colonial authorities. But what stands out is this: even the officials documenting the phenomenon could not explain it. They observed the pattern, they recorded the spread, but they could not identify its origin or purpose. The evidence exists, but the meaning remains unclear. 2. Administrative records and official responses. During cholera outbreaks, government and medical records show a different kind of evidence. Reports detail the spread of disease, the number of cases, and the attempts to contain it. But alongside these records, there are also accounts of unrest, riots, attacks on hospitals, resistance to medical intervention. In some cases, officials explicitly mention rumors, claims that doctors were poisoning patients or that hospitals were unsafe. These records confirm that the fear was real, not necessarily the cause of the disease, but the reaction to it. 3. Local accounts and community testimony. The Mercy Brown case is documented through a combination of newspaper articles, local reports, and later historical analysis. Newspapers at the time reported on the exhumation, often framing it as unusual, but not entirely incomprehensible within local belief systems. There was no sense that this was an isolated anomaly. Rather, it was treated as something that fit within an existing framework of explanation. And that is important, because it shows that what appears strange to us today did not necessarily appear strange to those experiencing it. 4. The problem of interpretation. Across all these cases, one pattern repeats in the evidence itself. The facts are often consistent, but the interpretations are not. Talismans were found, chapatis were passed, riots occurred, bodies were exhumed. These are observable events, but what they meant, then and now, is far less certain. And that creates a gap between event and explanation, a gap where multiple interpretations can exist at the same time. Official accounts, local beliefs, later historical analysis, all describing the same events, but not agreeing on what those events represent. 5. Comparison across cases. When we compare these events side by side, the similarities become difficult to ignore. Each case includes an ambiguous trigger, a period of uncertainty, a spread of interpretation, a collective response, and in each case, the documentation captures the event, but not the full meaning behind it. This is what makes these anomalies different from simple misunderstandings. They are not just errors. They are moments when the available evidence is not enough to settle interpretation. Moments when people, both then and now, are left trying to decide what they are seeing. So the historical record confirms something important. These events happened, but it does not fully explain them. And in that space between documentation and understanding, the mystery remains. At this point, the story moves beyond individual events, because what we have seen is not just a series of anomalies, it is a pattern, and that pattern suggests something larger about the 19th century itself. This was a period often described as the beginning of the modern world. Industrialization was accelerating. Empires were expanding. New technologies were transforming communication, transportation, and knowledge. On the surface, this was a time of increasing control, a time when science, administration, and institutions were expected to make the world more understandable, more predictable, more rational. But the events we have explored suggest something different. They suggest that alongside this expansion of knowledge, there was also a growing sense of instability, a gap between what people were told the world was becoming and what it actually felt like to live through it. Because modernization does not only produce clarity, it also produces disruption. Old systems weaken. New systems are not yet fully understood. Information increases, but so does contradiction. And in that environment, certainty becomes difficult to maintain. What we see in Japan, India, Europe, and the United States may be different expressions of the same underlying condition. A world in transition. A world where traditional explanations no longer fully apply, but new explanations have not yet taken hold. And in that space between old and new, something important happens. Meaning becomes unstable. People begin to rely less on established frameworks and more on interpretation, on signals, on patterns, on the possibility that events are connected in ways that are not immediately visible. This does not mean that these societies were irrational. It means they were responding to a situation that lacked clear answers. They were trying to make sense of change, using the tools they had available. And those tools included belief, tradition, rumor, observation, and collective behavior. So the talismans, the chapatis, the riots, and the exhumations are not just strange stories. They are moments when the process of understanding breaks down. When the usual ways of interpreting reality no longer feel sufficient, and something else takes their place. Something more fluid, more uncertain, more open to interpretation. And perhaps that is the deeper historical significance of these events. Not that they happened, but that they reveal how societies behave when meaning itself becomes unstable, when the line between event and interpretation begins to blur, and when people are no longer just observing the world, but actively trying to read it, which leads to a final question. Not about the 19th century alone, but about history more broadly, and perhaps even about the present. So what are we really looking at? A series of strange events scattered across different parts of the world? Or something more consistent? Something that appears whenever societies enter periods of uncertainty? Because the details may change. Paper in Japan, bread in India, medicine in Europe, the human body in America. But the underlying process feels familiar. Something happens. It is not fully understood, and people begin to interpret it, carefully at first, then collectively, until that interpretation starts to shape reality itself. The 19th century did not just produce new technologies, new empires, or new systems of knowledge. It may also have produced something less visible, a new kind of instability. Not in events, but in meaning. And if that is true, then these anomalies are not just historical curiosities. They are signals, not from the past to us, but about how humans respond when the world becomes difficult to understand. Because when certainty breaks down, people don't stop searching for meaning. They just start finding it in different places. And the question is, are these moments rare, or do they appear quietly whenever history begins to shift?